right, please be seated. All right, good morning.
Good morning.
Let's do that again. Good morning.
Good morning.
All right. My name is Melissa Burt, and I am the Associate Dean for Access and Success. On behalf of Colorado State University, I welcome you to the Spring 2026 Recognition Ceremony for the Walter Scott Jr. College of Engineering. At various times during the program, we may ask members of the graduating class or the audience to stand. Please do so as you are able. Before we begin the ceremony, I'd like to read the land acknowledgement statement. Colorado State University acknowledges with respect that the land we are on today is the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations and peoples. This was also a site of trade, gathering, and healing for numerous other Native tribes. We recognize that the indigenous peoples are original stewards of this land and all the relatives within it. As these words of acknowledgement are spoken and heard, the ties nations have to their traditional homelands are renewed and reaffirmed. CSU is founded as a land-grant institution, and we accept that our mission must encompass access to education and inclusion, and significantly, that our founding came at a dire cost to Native nations and peoples whose land this university was built upon. This acknowledgement is the education and inclusion we must practice in recognizing our institutional history, responsibility, and commitment.
Good morning. Oh, we could do that again. Okay. My name is Sam Bashara, and I am the Associate Dean for Undergraduate Affairs. I would like to introduce those on the stage today. Would each of you stand briefly when I call your name? I would like to ask that we hold any applause until all names are called. Dr. Rebecca Adedero, Professor, Civil and Environmental Engineering. Dr. Dan Baker, Teaching Associate Professor, Walter Scott Jr. College of Engineering. Dr. Melissa Burt, Associate Dean for Access and Success. Dr. Chandrasekhar, Associate Dean, International Programs. Dr. Edwin Chong, Department Head, Electrical and Computer Engineering. Robert Lamb, Graduating Student Speaker, along with his dog Fletcher. Dr. Christian Putlitz, Department Head, Mechanical Engineering. Dr. Kenneth Reardon, Associate Dean for Research. Mark Richard, Assistant Dean for Operations, and Dr. Alan Robinson, Dean, Walter Scott Jr. College of Engineering. In 1916, Congress created the Reserves Officers Training Corps, the ROTC, which provides military training at civilian educational institutions. Will those graduates who are commissioned as second lieutenants in the United States Army or Air Force, or students who are veterans, or any branch of the United States military services, please stand and receive our thanks and respect. Now, will any of our audience members who are active duty or veterans of any branch of the United States military services please stand and receive our thanks and respect. I'd now like to invite Melissa Burt back to the podium to recognize our first generation graduates.
All right. Sorry. As a land-grant institution, Colorado State University takes special pride in our role in providing access and educating students who are the first in their family to earn a university degree. This semester, 70 of our students who are earning their undergraduate degrees today from the Walter Scott Jr. College of Engineering are first-generation college students. Some of these graduates may be wearing a special stole or medallion with an orange ribbon. I ask that all of our graduates who are first generation to please stand and be recognized. Please be seated. Congratulations and best wishes to you.
It is now my pleasure to recognize students who are graduating with distinctions and honors. The candidates for University Honors Scholar must complete a program of academic excellence which includes honors seminars, honors courses in their major, and a senior honors thesis, while achieving at least a 3.5 cumulative grade point average. These scholar candidates are wearing green regalia, and those with gold cords are also candidates for graduation with Latin distinction. I'd also like to acknowledge our students graduating with highest distinction based upon their cumulative grade point average. These graduates may be wearing gold bachelor's insignia. Summa cum laude graduates are the top 1% of the class, magna cum laude graduates are the next 3% of the class, and cum laude graduates are the next 6% of the class. Will our honors scholars, as well as those students earning Latin distinction, please stand as a group and so we can applaud your amazing achievements. Please be seated. I'd now like to invite Dan Baker to the podium to introduce our graduating student speaker.
Our graduating student speaker, Robert Lamb, came to Colorado State University as a first-generation community college transfer student with a clear sense of purpose and a perspective shaped by challenge, resilience, and gratitude. I had the privilege of meeting Robert on his first day to campus, and it was immediately clear that he brought something special to our community. Throughout his time here, Robert not only succeeded academically, but also helped shape a more inclusive environment for others. I've been proud to advocate for Robert to ensure that he and students like him have had the support they need to thrive. Robert represents what we hope for in every graduate, someone who uses their education not only to build a career, but also to make a meaningful impact to others. Please join me in welcoming Robert Lamb and his guide dog, Fletcher.
Thank you, Dr. Baker. Sorry about that. And good morning. Thank you, Dean Robinson, faculty, staff, family, friends, and the graduating Walter Scott Jr. class of 2026. My name is Robert Lamb, and I'm honored to represent today's class as a graduating environmental engineer minoring in sustainable water management, here alongside my guide dog, Fletcher. CSU's land grant mission has taught me something that I've come to respect more each year. Access may open the door, but belonging is what helps people grow once they're inside. Many of us know what it means to rebuild momentum. We began college in the shadow of COVID, when connection felt quieter and campus rhythm had to return. Over time, I watched that rhythm return, not all at once, but through small moments, walking the oval, napping in the oval, cheering at Canvas and Moby, seeing E-Days bring creativity for engineering out to life. Further, working at the front desk at the College of Engineering, I watched so many daily shifts with that momentum. From watching students mentor each other, leading project teams, welcoming new Rams to campus, and really carrying more responsibility than they ever gave themselves credit. Beyond that, like we mentioned today, I saw more first-generation students walk in and get their first-generation medals than ever this year, almost 25% of our class. On that note, to every first-gen Ram here today, you really helped shape what this community has become, so thank you for that. That is part of what makes this college so special. Here, leadership is really quiet, practical service. Walter Scott Jr. further challenged students to do a couple things: do great things and be a lifelong learner. Those words really fit this class well. A few of the other things that we practiced were modeling, labs, systems thinking, and design. But beyond that, we also learned how to practice working across differences, ask better questions, and keep iterating until a solution became a reality. Through my sustainable water interdisciplinary management minor, SWIM, we all love our acronyms, I was introduced to One Water, the idea that water connects communities, disciplines, and ecosystems. No one field solves those problems alone. Progress happens when silos break down and we work together. Honestly, that describes this class pretty well too, I'd have to say. As a non-traditional student navigating vision loss, I experienced CSU's commitment to inclusion firsthand. I found professors like Dr. Baker, classmates, and staff who all made room at the table because they understood that better solutions and better engineering came from broader perspectives. Even Fletcher, my guide dog, laying at Dr. Bashara's feet here, came a big part of that story. He might be the most popular one here, to be honest. As we have all grown, campus has grown around us. The new spaces will rise, new traditions will take shape, and new Rams will find their place. But with that, I hope they inherit what this class has helped rebuild, a class and a college that are here for each other. Class of 2026, we graduate into a world with real challenges ahead: water scarcity, aging infrastructure, climate change, and systems that need fresh thinking. Lucky timing for the world, though. They have a class that already knows how to adapt, collaborate, and rebuild. Congratulations, Rams. Let's go build what comes next with purpose, unity, and the courage to do great things.
Thank you, Robert and Fletcher. It is now our honor to recognize the outstanding individuals who have earned their bachelor's degrees. We invite the department heads to join us in celebrating the perseverance, passion, and extraordinary effort that have led these graduates to this defining moment. Each name we call represents not just an academic achievement, but a story of growth, discovery, and commitment to excellence. As we announce their names, let us acknowledge the bright futures that they will shape and the pride we share in their accomplishments.
We will now present diplomas to the undergraduates from the School of Biomedical and Chemical Engineering, beginning with our biomedical engineering graduates, each of whom is also earning a second engineering degree in electrical, chemical and biological, or mechanical engineering. Achieving 2 engineering degrees simultaneously speaks to their extraordinary dedication and to the interdisciplinary strength at the heart of this institution. Lael Neiman. Evan Law, magna cum laude. Bryson Arnott. Adrian DePuta. Samuel James Schroeder. Luke Pettis. Dylan Paul. Matthew Merkelovich, cum laude. Tessa Jorgensen. Camden Nicole Henderberger. Haley Ilanit Stern, magna cum laude. Brenton Yasuoka. Isabella Kays, magna cum laude. Alisa Basildua. Elizabeth Emberger. Jackson Emery. Delaney Indeen. Are we waiting for this? But is this the? Stephen Richard, summa cum laude. Nick Grasso. Renzo Spagnolo. Raylee Sen. Zoe Blaze. Jacqueline Oswald. Kayla Titus. Victoria Grace Entwistle. Matthew Ashworth. Ella Dorr. Amber Clark. Larissa Aragon. Andy Quach. Abby Mae Wheaton. Emma Carol Goodall. Ella Catherine Bowman, magna cum laude. Emma Holloway, cum laude. Hannah Walkner. Elijah Jackson. Gabriella Jonathan. Bella Plath. Mariana Salsilla. Fig Adelina Veldhuizen. Alvina Yaboa. Ava Fisher, magna cum laude. Rosa Dang. Abadir. Mimi Abadir. Alec Brickle. Brian Brown, cum laude. Alex Toko. Caroline Diane Pita. Heidi Hamilton, cum laude. Zoe Cowman. Sophia Phillips. Julia Moreno. There we go. Mary Catherine Joyce Kerrigan McCarthy. Rebecca Noel Ballou. Anisha Kala. Owen Geiger, summa cum laude. We will now award diplomas to students earning their degrees in chemical and biological engineering. Bethany Kantuck. Soraya Carmunchi, cum laude. Caitlin Brennan, cum laude. Marin Casper Bower. Vivian Newell. Peyton Musselman, cum laude. Ridge Tyler. Erica Matheson. Colin Wald. Sergei. Caleb Sergei. Brooke Hazard. Hans Van Zuden. Roman Schwab. Zachary Maxwell. Jacob Footit. Andrew Van Orden. Adam Davis. Michael Farah. Kara Geidish, magna cum laude. Manuela Rivera Villota. Mallory Glenn, cum laude. Kira Lawrence. Natalie Callahan, cum laude. Greta Coiner, summa cum laude. Rourke Adams. Ben Hayden. Bennett Norton. Scott Ropecki. Hajar Alatar. Karina Zito. Haley Harrington. Medeth Alajmi. Abdullah Alzabi. Khalid Alejmi. Ethan Seacott. Gavin Vonalt. Caleb Zimmer. Jacob Van Ens. That concludes our awarding of diplomas for the School of Biomedical and Chemical Engineering.
We will now award diplomas to the undergraduates from the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering. Brooke Bauer. Michelle Vasquez. Valentina Diaz. David Elijah Umaru. Gavin Boland. Tyler Carver. Gabrielle Ferrer. Graham Kunselman, cum laude. Thomas Walter Rogers. Elam Aschenberg. Sal Berman. Jaden Gangwer. Stephen McKenzie. Joey Reback, summa cum laude. Isa Fontana. Alexander Benson. Joe Mullenhaupt, cum laude. Braden McGuire, cum laude. Luis Banuelos. Zacchaeus Carchi Easterly. Maxwell Smiley. Pa Kwisi Adom Ubing. Harrison Payne. Ethan Lay, magna cum laude. Miles Mayer Bickle. Dylan Shapansky, cum laude. Caden Sandvik. Chase Griffith. Kyler Bronick. David Chen. Kyle Wong. Paul Brodeland. Isaiah Trujillo. David Samuel Condino Templo Nuevo. Adam Eicher, cum laude. Garrett Furman, cum laude. Kelly Parham. Ethan Zerba. Cody Saunders, cum laude. Theo Van Zant, cum laude. Emily Petrasic. John Wolniak. Mitchell Gilchrist. Michael Brumbaugh. Salman Al-Daha Fahari. Abdullah Al-Abdullah. Abdul Aziz Al-Kaldi. Abraham Alfueres. Mitchell Aarons. Mason Lawrence. Nicholas DeBay. George Cryer. Christopher Ramallo. Tyler Sywick. Aiden Leroy. That concludes our awarding of diplomas for the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering.
We will now award diplomas to the undergraduates from the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. Robert Lamb. Haley Frazier. Luke Vikiet. Dawson Carney, summa cum laude. Nian Crouch, magna cum laude. Benjamin Howard. Justin Sean, magna cum laude. Alan Martuch. Zachariah Collins. Jalen Erickson. Joshua Gorton. Kieran Baltunis. Grogan Block. Charlie Harrell. Hugh McCurran, summa cum laude. Josh Cates, magna cum laude. Porter Kane. Sawyer Haywood Kaiser. Alexis Ruvacaba. Giselle Balderrama Hernandez. Jackson Rowena. Joseph Wardlaw. Mason Garrett. Nora Renee Artley, magna cum laude. Paris Carey, cum laude. Zoe Bierman. Ashley Dominic. Owen Gruda. Ryan Messenger. Aliaktan Alharthi, cum laude. Joseph Mendez. Edward Koenig Beagle. Brendan Smith. Jack Kappas. Drew Anthony Stover. Evan Walls. Kale Singer. John Hebert. Catherine Aaliyah Rose Lambert. Alejandra Acevedo. Taylor Reve Miller. Audra Lee Anderson. Ryan Murphy. Marcus Olson. Davis Cutforth. Mackenzie Phillips. Madison Beats, cum laude. Ella Femig. Annabelle Westland. Brendan Gilbride. Riley Hopper. Olivia Proctor. Emily Armstrong. Abigail Norton. Camden Krumholtz. Kira Toomey. Emma Snell. Lucas Dahmer. Sabin Yanez. Dylan Schneider. Brendan Ullman. Anthony Reeves. Sonia Williams. Claire Margaret Turner, cum laude. Victoria Jones. Megan Wegner. Emma Berg. Dylan Wellman. Benjamin Elick. TJ Matheny. Jack Whitehead. Maverick Cody. Kellen Ferry. Jack Turville. Diego Brisenio. Talon Hall. Dylan Shanafelt. Mark Westbecker. Toby Shannon. Owen Roberts. Dylan Young. Blake Smith. Abigail Jane Tripp. Luna Valenzuela. Kaylee Romero Garcia. Romina Villanueva Escalada. Amanda Buter. Ahmad Aladwani. Safina Mohammed. Richard Lovelace. Megan Ebert. Kiri Lavonder. Hannah Bailey, magna cum laude. Brendan Todd. Carolyn Malcoach, cum laude. Reagan Brooke Ames. Rosemary Ayers, cum laude. Bianca Hasland, cum laude. Alexandra Vaughn Johnson. Anne Catherine Macababi. Abigail Lee Beauregard. Sydney Adams. Jack Everett Waylon Gibbs. Margot Anita Cohen. Abdul Wahab Alali. Ahmed Olealan. Abdullah Fahed Alajmi. Hatch Nelson. Jack Barr. Oh. That concludes our awarding of diplomas for the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering.
We will now award diplomas to the undergraduates from the Department of Mechanical Engineering. Chinmay Jayanti. John C. Luera. Matthias Bong. Jason Taylor. Stuart Beaker, cum laude. Carter Smith. Dexter Schaefer White. Ian Kelly. Derek Dooling. Max Trias, summa cum laude. Nathan Madeke. Jared Silbernagel, summa cum laude. Will Coons. Noah Boehner. Sebastian Dupree. Caleb Joseph Tesley. Preciosa Trinity Ubriel. Ben Guyer. Michael Daniel Till. James Bailey Dent. Joshua Llewellyn Price. Connor Hart. Jacob Alman. Logan Webb. Andrew Holland. Mason Maynell. Adrian Jimenez Ramos. Jack Stern. Adam Ruelas. Lily Perez. Tyler Schukert. Connor Morgan. Brendan Caterino. Thomas Miller. Peter Newhart. Everett Surf. Uzio Beltran. Audrey Brooks, magna cum laude. Christian Cordova. Alexandra Houston. Charles Hund. Ethan Sterling. Eder Rubio. Peter O'Toole. Tyler Archer, summa cum laude. Oscar Swartzen-Wenham. Oscar was also selected as this year's outstanding graduate for the Walter Scott Junior College of Engineering. Jesse Shergill. Eric Jonathan. Safian Alam. Evan Sennert. Ella Olander. Mason Daly. Caden Fancher. Andrew John Hunsinger. Cameron Lindeman. Brandon Schreiner. Colin Christensen, cum laude. Case Linden. Billy O'Brien. Luke Langus. Broderick Hawker. Jude Rudd, cum laude. Mike Goen. Benjamin Perforce, magna cum laude. Cameron Jones. Alex Tongren. Dylan West. And Jace Nakasone, cum laude. Hayes Kammer. Alexander Winkler. Brooke Isabel Carlson. Natalie Nealis. Sarah Vogler. Michael McKinnon. Riley Cronin. Jet Harrison. Austin Cecil, cum laude. Max Burdine. Isaac Salisbury. Gray Woodson. Gavin McCommon. Alex Henningfield. Jace Erland. Blake Albee. Nicholas Becker. Jason Kaplan. Eric Olson, summa cum laude. Michaela Berchichi. Olivia Graves. Dominic Hassick. Brianna Rabari. Abby Ruth. Matthew Sieben. Anthony Lombardo. Everett Serkey. Roger Perkins. Philip Nelson. Rory Stone, cum laude. Ryan Weglar. Jeff Diaz. Hudson Byers. Isaiah Carter. Savannah Voyden-Sill. Daniel Fisher. Jacqueline Andreessen, cum laude. Luke Jensen, cum laude. Gerard Garcia. Christopher Thomas Rivera. Jacob Jenkins, cum laude. Max Goodrich, summa cum laude. Omar Cisse. Joseph Pigatti. Graham Smith. Vance Peterson. Caden Edson. Ella Martyr. Emily Thomason. Jack Wall. Willem Larson. Eric Buffington. Eric Laurson. Carly Schofer. Kaylin Sapp. Tyler Avey. Trevor Olson. Rachel Lorenzen, cum laude. Tara Stout. Kai Nguyen. Doken O. Gavin Housden. Dylan Frey. Amit Patel. Joshua Smith. Bo Noland. Ben Kerbo. Gavin Gear. Alex Gallegos. Jacob McCallum. Ryan Smith, magna cum laude. Jenna Martin. Tamsin Izard, cum laude. Robert Hartenbush. Conrad Anson. Angelo Pira. Claire Dahlbeck. Ryan Gregory Rodoff. Alexander Coe. Noah Guzman. Guzman? Tariq Thomas. Christopher Lambert. Soliana Dowdrick. Diction Sherpa. Daisy Cochran. Ian Osborne. DeAndre Rogers. Peyton Van Blaircom. Jack Herlihy. Carter Brighton. Abdul Rahman Khamis Ahmed Al-Kabani, cum laude. Hamza Mohsen Nasser Al-Sami. Parker Orth. Jake Dunn. Ryan Foster. Nick Olmstead. Tomas Aziala. Tyler Nordengren. Johnny Diesel. Carson Hobson. Luke Javed. Kai Owen. Mason Bowen. Connor Bartnick. Alex Ringerud. Derek Boyerman. Crawford Webb. Joe Santos. Michael Langston. Justin Haas. Alex Tutino. Jackson Hunter. Noah Tholey. Dylan Stiglitz, cum laude. Ian Hoff. Bradley Butler. Nate Human. Caden Stapleton. Gage Steinke. Joshua Butler. Gregory Hyder. Abner Itzap Velasquez. Bryce Rubino. Jack Gottschalk. That concludes our awarding of diplomas for the Department of Mechanical Engineering. I now invite Dean Alan Robinson to the podium for the awarding of our final degree.
All right, what a day. So Emily, I think we forgot one diploma. So we've got one more diploma to award today, and it's to Fletcher. We're going to give Fletcher a 3D printed dog Turo. Congratulations, Fletcher, and congratulations to all our graduates today. My name's Alan Robinson. I have the privilege of serving as the Dean of the Walter Scott Junior College of Engineering. And graduation is always one of my favorite days because it gives me so much optimism. And it gives me so much optimism because of all of you guys and all the amazing things that you're going to do when you go out into the world and engineer a world of difference. And so let's give one more huge round of applause to the graduates here. And so it's been an incredible journey, and you've worked really hard, but you haven't been able to do it alone. And so I think there are a few other groups of folks we want to congratulate and thank for the role, the critical role they played. And the first is the faculty. The faculty have gotten up, worked hard to impart and share their knowledge and their passion for their discipline. So if the faculty could please rise over there, and we'll acknowledge you. But it takes more than just faculty to run a university. And really a critical part of our educational program are our advisors, our academic advisors. If our advisors could please stand up. As well as our lab support staff. Justin, I see you. Stand up, please. They come in every day and add really the compassion that is Colorado State in our hands-on learning that really differentiates an education at the Walter Scott Junior College of Engineering from any other institution of higher ed. So thank you so much. And finally, and most important of all, I'm looking at you, a lot of folks in the stands. I'd like the graduates to please stand and to thank your loved ones, your parents, your caregivers, your partners for the amazing role that they've played to get you to this day. All right, so just a couple of words for myself. I just leave you with some parting thoughts. Today's graduation is not the end of the journey, but really it's the beginning. It's a significant milestone, but it's to go on and do great things, as our benefactor Walter Scott Jr. says. The degree that each of you are receiving here today is a fulfillment of the vision of Abraham Lincoln. Over 150 years ago, signed the Morrill Act to establish the land-grant universities, providing access to an excellent world-class education and success to anybody that had the tools and the desires to make a difference in society, no matter their economic background or where they came from. The land-grant universities is a really incredible enterprise. If we think about engineering, before the land-grant universities, there were only tens or maybe hundreds of engineering graduates in the United States. But when the land-grant universities, that increased to thousands and tens of thousands of graduates, engineering graduates, which has transformed the world and transformed our society. So higher education continues to be an incredibly powerful tool to better not only your own life, but those around you and society as a whole. And I think this is especially true when you graduate with an engineering degree from Colorado State University. And that's because we really live in a very technology-driven world. Technology is rapidly advancing, and society is facing an incredible number of challenges, from delivering affordable health care to meeting our needs for environmentally sustainable energy. No one knows how to meet that future. I don't know how, but I'm really confident that you guys know how to meet that future and solve those problems, and I'm really optimistic about that future. So the final bit of the charge is you have not just the ability, but also the responsibility to make our world a better place. Lead by example, and you will bring others along with you. All of us in the college will be watching with great and incredible pride as you all go and have your impact to make the world a better place. So one final thought, Colorado State is a really special community. And so just because you're graduating today does not mean you're leaving our community. So please stay in touch. Our family extends well beyond the borders of the campus. And it's especially important to stay in touch with your friends and classmates. They're an incredibly powerful network, and together you will make the world a better place. Support each other, come back and visit often. The door is always open. We'd always be excited to hear about your incredible accomplishments. We look forward to seeing you at reunions, homecomings, E-days, or maybe it's just that Tuesday in February when you happen to be in Fort Collins. On behalf of our faculty, staff, and students, thank you, everyone, for being here to celebrate this extraordinary day. Take a moment and pause and reflect on what this achievement represents, the late nights, the perseverance, and the support that brought you here. This is your moment. Savor it. Congratulations, class of 2026. So this concludes the Walter Scott Jr. College of Engineering Spring 2026 graduation ceremony. I'd ask the audience to please remain seated while the graduates, faculty, and platform group depart. We ask all the family and friends to meet their graduates outside the arena following the recessional so that we're able to turn the facility over for the next ceremony. Thank you, and go Rams! Recess.